Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday the 12th of May and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. We are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Chris Law MP. Chris is the member of the Westminster Parliament for Dundee West. He was first elected in 2015 to represent a constituency that had been Labour for 65 years. He is currently the SNP shadow spokesperson on international development and sits in that Parliament's International Development Committee. He's also the shadow spokesperson on climate justice. During his parliamentary career, Chris has secured a debate in Westminster Hall on protecting children in conflict, served as the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on video games, and has been a supporter of drug reform laws. Following his re-election in 2019, he backed the decriminalisation of drugs and the establishment of drug consumption rooms in Dundee. Good evening, Chris. Thank you for joining us on Scotland at 7. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. And good evening, Andrew. It's good to be here.
Well, we're delighted that you could join us. First of all, this evening, we have the daily coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,955,285 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 1,726,862 have been confirmed negative and 228,423 have tested positive. There are 345 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus COVID-19 infection now stands at 7,661. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of those who have tested positive, 65 were in hospital last night, 6 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 2,948,604 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 1,526,889 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 127,640 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 11 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. We also have a National Records of Scotland update this evening. As at 9 May, 10,104 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus COVID-19 was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published today by the National Records of Scotland. In the week 3rd May to 9th May, 7 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, and that is a decrease of 12 deaths on the rate from the previous week. At a council level, North Lanarkshire recorded 2 COVID-related deaths, and Angus, Glasgow City, Inverclyde, Midlothian and South Lanarkshire each recorded 1 death. 86% of deaths were people aged 75 and over, representing 6 deaths, and 14%, representing 1 death, were under 65. 5 deaths occurred in hospitals, 1 death occurred in a care home, and 1 in a non-institutional setting, such as at home. Firstly, this evening, we have an update from the Middle East, where Israeli strikes have terrified inhabitants of Gaza. On Tuesday, Israeli jets hit one of the tower blocks in Gaza City's Rimal district, an 8-storey apartment block where Hassan Abu al-Atta, a deputy commander of Islamic Jihad's Gaza Brigade, who is blamed for rocket attacks against Israel, was sheltering. The killing of Abu al-Atta has been one of several targeting military figures from Hamas and Islamic Jihad in what Israeli security officials have admitted is a campaign of assassination. From Khan Yunis in Gaza's south to Beit Lahia in the north, close to the border wall, Israeli strikes have hit cars and houses, Hamas-run police stations and apartment blocks, bringing at least one to the ground and filling the air with explosives and concrete dust. By Wednesday morning, a wall of dark grey smoke cloaked Gaza City. Residents said the latest strikes had hit the Hamas-run Central Police headquarters. It is the attacks on the apartment towers, however, that have brought back frightening memories for Gazans of 2014, when the city's high-rises were also attacked, a tactic that is under investigation by the International Criminal Court. Israel will not stop its military operation in Gaza until complete quiet has been achieved, the country's defense minister has said, as airstrikes and rocket fire continued throughout today. Since Monday, the Israeli military has carried out hundreds of airstrikes in Gaza, and Palestinian militant groups have fired multiple rocket barrages at Israeli cities. 2 high-rise buildings containing apartments and offices in Gaza City have been targeted. Gaza's death toll has risen to 48, including 14 children, and more than 300 people have been wounded. 6 Israelis, including a child, have been killed by Palestinian rockets. Tor Vennesland, the UN's Middle East envoy, said leaders on all sides must take the responsibility of de-escalation. Ahead of briefing the 15 members of the UN Security Council on the crisis today, its second such meeting in 3 days, Vennesland warned that the cost of war in Gaza is devastating and is being paid by ordinary people. He urged they stop the fire immediately and warned of escalating towards a full-scale war. Now, Chris, what do you think we should consider doing to alleviate the suffering of the people of Gaza and also Israeli families now caught in this conflict?
So, for those who have been watching the horrific scenes on our news channels those last couple of days, it's just astonishing to believe that in this day and age, particularly with COVID and particularly the difficulties it faced, that Israel is in a position where it's like David and Goliath. They're a far stronger force, and their disproportionate force against Palestine seems to know no end. The UK government is not in a position at the moment, I think, to say much more than empty words, and we need to now consider whether it's appropriate to continue to provide arms to Israeli forces if they're going to be used in such a way. We should consider also what robust measures can be taken by the UK as a whole to sanction Israeli activities in illegally occupied territories, which for years we have seen an ever rapid expansion into the Palestinian West Bank. Obviously, on both sides, all measures that have been taking place must now cease. Certainly, restraint needs to be exercised. And I think for the UK government, as well as the US, they need to play a far more serious role than what we have seen under Donald Trump in the last 4 years, which was very partisan. This is affecting civilian populations on both sides. As I said earlier, it's disproportionate against Palestine, with 14 young innocent children and 1 child in Israel that's been killed so far. So there needs to be a lot more engagement, real engagement, because the peace process so far has failed, and we don't want to return to where we saw ground troops from Israel enter Gaza as it did in 2014.
Thanks, Chris. Firstly, I'm struck by the language used by the Israeli Defense Minister, where he says that their operation will continue until complete quiet has been achieved. Do you think he's threatening to level the country? Is he suggesting there that there is no line that the Israeli military will not cross in seeking to quell the activities in Gaza?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. This morning, I was actually listening to the defence correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, who was interviewed by Victoria Derbyshire on BBC One News. And she explained that she doesn't see this ending in days. It's probably going to be weeks, even a month. And her, as I've said already, her biggest concern is about ground troops entering Gaza. Breaking international law must have consequences. And the problem up to now has been that Israel's more or less had a lot more leeway than, let's say, other nation states around the world who have committed the kind of things that break international law that we've been roundly condemning. And I think that there's never any excuses for civilians being targeted. So in terms of what this does for Palestine and certainly relationships going on in the future, there needs to be much more exercised pressure put on Israel, whether that is through the pressure from the UK government, the US, whether it's about visiting about the sale of arms, something I've spoken about very openly before, particularly with selling arms to Saudi-led coalition against Yemen. And of course, the SNP condemn all violence, whoever perpetrates it and whoever's perpetuated against. And the circumstances that led up to this, as we know, was with the police officers that entered the mosque during prayer, which created such hostilities. It has been said that it may well have been to lead to a provocation. However, this is not the time to assess that. But what should happen is certainly that international law must be observed. And if it's not being observed, people need to be held to account like they would do anywhere else in the world.
That's a very good point, Chris. And one other thing before we move to the next story, you mentioned President Trump, and you mentioned the rule of law. What do you think? Do you have any ideas as to what President Joe Biden should do now?
Well, the difficulty under Donald Trump was twofold. One was that he was extremely partisan to the point where he moved the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, as you know, is shared by three faiths, Christian, Judaism, as well as Islam. So it's a holy city for three religions. Now, I'm not particularly religious myself, but just on the basis of respect of those people who live there, and also as a holy city, they think that would only exacerbate the situation. He's certainly been very pro-Israel up until now. So I think Joe Biden has an opportunity, a really good opportunity, at a time where America is already facing more than one truth, as it were, or has alternative truths as it started to emerge under Donald Trump, and the challenges you have about basing things in evidence. International law is there for a good reason. It's a good reason to get to the bottom of things. It's what brings out the truth and also brings out reconciliation. And the only way Israel and Palestine are going to be able to move forward is to face up to the truths on both sides of what is happening, what's going wrong, the horrific scenes that we're all witnessing just now, and also to be able to build peace and true reconciliation. And it's something as a two-state solution, which I fully support, so does the SNP, is something we urgently need to move towards. I mean, this last year we've seen conflicts emerge or prolong during COVID, which is affecting every society all over the world as a result of pandemic. This is the least time really for starting a new conflict. And if this develops into an all-out war, which we've heard with the language used of silence the Palestinian state, then it's going to have consequences for the rest of the Middle East, where already we're seeing tensions. And we also have war, for example, in Yemen, and ends of troubles coming out of Syria.
Thanks, Chris. You make some great points there, and we'll continue to report on this story, I suspect, daily for the foreseeable future. Now, we will move to matters domestic for a moment, and that's the uptick in COVID cases in Glasgow. There is concern about an uptick in COVID-19 cases in Glasgow, as the latest case rate for the city is at 58.3 per 100,000 of population, which is above the threshold which allows COVID restrictions to be eased. Health officials are investigating clusters of high infection rates in parts of the city, and there are concerns that the India variant may be present. Easing of restrictions came in on the 26th of April, with further relaxations of the lockdown due to come in on Monday the 17th of May. The high rate of community transmission of COVID in Morayshire is also continuing to cause concerns. Public health officials have said that people should continue to be cautious as we come out of lockdown, and they should continue to observe facts with face coverings, avoiding crowds, cleaning hands, keeping 2 metres apart, and self-isolating if they show symptoms. So, Chris, we've seen reports today of the increase in the rate of infection in Glasgow and in Morayshire. What do you think's going on here?
Well, there's a little more I can add, other than if there are clusters, it means either that we don't know, there's not been enough information given so far. So I know a little more than you've already suggested about the clusters, but what's really concerning is we're at a point where society is opening up and we need to open up. Obviously, based on the science and evidence of the spread of COVID, it's a real concern. So places like Glasgow and particularly Moray, which has got a rate of over 100 per 100,000 in terms of infections, there are concerns about not just being COVID as we've expected, particularly the Kent variant we had more recently, but the much more faster spreading variants. There's two particular variants that have come out of India, one of which is spreads much faster. So I look to find out what more information comes out tomorrow regarding this, but it is a deep concern. Glasgow's our biggest city in Scotland. Our shops have just opened in the last week. People are starting to move about. And I think we just need to re-emphasise to everybody, so many people, all of us have worked so hard during lockdown to protect ourselves and our families and each other. And we need to remember those facts, those 5 key things that we need to do to restrict the spread of COVID. And we also have the rollout just now, of course, which has been going extremely well here in Scotland with regards to the vaccinations. And hopefully that will come to an end in the coming months soon. But of course, the biggest issue with COVID is that no one is safe until everyone's safe. And if the Indian city of New Delhi, which I know very well because I worked in India over a number of years in the past, and all the other cities and the villages and towns, the scenes we get from India, are a very sharp reminder of how a country which just a few months ago seemed to have been completely on top of COVID, it's now running out of control. So it's really important that those in Glasgow take extra precautions, make sure they're doing all the things with regards to face coverings, social distancing, and washing hands. Because if this is the Indian variant, then it means it's more than likely going to spread much more so than we've seen previously.
Thanks, Chris. Those are some very useful points that you make in reiterating the Scottish Government's advice. We'll move on to our next story now, which is that Unison members have voted to accept the Scottish NHS offer of a 4% pay rise. Unison members in Scotland have voted overwhelmingly to accept the Scottish Government's 4% pay increase for Scottish NHS workers. The Scottish Government made the offer before the end of the last session of the Scottish Parliament ended for the elections. The Scottish 4% pay rise is in stark contrast to the 1% offered by Boris Johnson to NHS workers in England. Now, firstly, Chris, what might this story say about the differing priorities between the Scottish Government and the government in Westminster?
Well, it's breathtaking that given the challenges of the last year, where we've learned through this pandemic how critical the role of nurses, care workers, doctors, medics, ambulance drivers, all those who have helped to protect thousands upon thousands of lives as a direct result of COVID, but also the pressures they've been put under at work, endless hours every week to work. It is astonishing that the UK government has not moved to a more substantial pay rise. Now, it's not just that. This has been a long-standing issue in the UK, and in particular in England, where we saw restraint after 2010 financial crash, where the burden of what was essentially the bankers' crash was taken up by public sector pay freezes. So the 4% pay increase in Scotland is welcome. I'm very pleased that Unison, I think it was 84% of their ballot voted in favour of it. Other unions had suggested more. However, at the very least, if we are going to thank our, 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 our National Health Service, all those who work within it, uh, the real way to do it is not just with the £500 thank you, which was important, that was announced earlier this year, and every nurse got, I think, in their April pay packet, but also that this 4% pay rise reflects a real increase. Obviously, we'd like to go further, but at the moment, this is a substantial increase and a real increase, which I'm pleased we're able to do. I think at a UK level, given the sum of priorities we've seen already that have been announced where spend's going to be, it's astonishing how little we have regard at a UK level for National Health Service. And for many years, we've been concerned about private contracts for the sell-off of various parts of the NHS, right through to the pay within the health and social care system. And in fact, social care wasn't even in the Queen's speech yesterday, which is a real priority, or was suggested by Boris Johnson in 2019 as being a real priority for his government. So it's a good step in Scotland, and it shows that our priorities are about an inclusive society where we bring everyone along, and also to pay those who have put their lives on the line to protect other people's lives during this last year.
Thanks, Chris. There was one other thing I was going to ask you about this story, and that's that the leadership of Unison had advised members to vote against the 4% pay offer. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are about what appears to be a gap between the senior leadership in Unison and its hardworking members, many of whom, as you've just said, have been on the front line during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, Unison wasn't alone actually in encouraging in this particular union. Yes, that's correct. But other unions have been also calling for larger increases. I think the fact that it's been accepted so overwhelmingly by its members, despite where the union was with this, says really a lot about those who work within the health services, about what their priorities are. And 4% is a fair pay increase. Might not be ideal, but it's a fair pay increase. Of course, many of those be aware of the struggles that other people in societies have right now. Lots of people lost their jobs at the early part of the pandemic. Lots of people in furlough that may well lose their jobs as we come out and the furlough ends. People who are on universal credit may well see the £20 top-up disappear. So people are mindful of their community, their society, their friends, their family, their neighbours. And so 4% is a fair increase, and I think that's why members overwhelmingly supported it. For Unison to be out of touch on this seems a little bit extraordinary, because the ballot, it shows that clearly they weren't listening. And a union's role is really to reflect their members and to make sure that they're heard properly. So to be out of kilter it doesn't chime well, I guess, for the members, and I wonder what our members will be thinking this evening.
Thanks, Chris. We'll return now to Westminster and the news that the UK government inquiry into the response to COVID will start in the spring of 2022. Boris Johnson has announced that a public inquiry into the UK government's handling of the COVID pandemic will be launched early in 2022. The all-party parliamentary group on coronavirus, which has spearheaded calls for a public inquiry into the pandemic, responded by saying in a statement that delaying the inquiry by another year will only prolong the pain being felt by grieving families and means vital lessons will go unlearned. The statement went on to say that there is no time to waste in ensuring the NHS and social care sector are better prepared against COVID variants and a potential third wave. Leila Moran MP, the chair of the APPG on coronavirus, added, "Our cross-party inquiry will continue to hold the government to account and ensure the mistakes of the past are not repeated as we enter the next critical stage of the pandemic." So, Chris, what hopes have you for this inquiry going ahead promptly?
Well, like so many things at Westminster level, we can look at the Greenfell inquiry, how long that's taken. We can look at, for example, the Windrush inquiry and how long it took to respond. To wait basically a year before you begin the inquiry, it seems to be out of step. We've already had a report this morning that was critical, in fact, of the early stages of the pandemic, delivered the way it was communicated by nation states as well as the World Health Organization. So there's already evidence that has been accumulated so far. The COVID pandemic's been the most difficult time for many in our lives, and it's right that we learn from this and reflect on the experiences, and particularly those who've been directly affected by COVID, either through the loss of someone in their family or indeed through their experience. And of course, we now have people suffering from long COVID. I think this delay is a cack-handed response. The SNP has been very clear when they re-elected the Commission, a statutory, person-centred and human rights-based public inquiry into the handling of the coronavirus pandemic in Scotland. As we know, mistakes have been made in all of these islands, and we need to learn from them, and that's important. And we must hear the voices of families who have lost loved ones as part of establishing an inquiry, and that needs to happen as soon as possible.
Thanks, Chris. Do you think the cabinet? Well, do you think it's either in cack-handedness, or is this the cabinet and the prime minister perhaps trying to put a distance between themselves and the darkest days of the pandemic, perhaps relying on the what's described as the vaccination bounce, in order to give them a little bit of protection in the inquiry?
I think that's a really good question. If you look at the language that was used by the UK government leading up to the first lockdown, coming out of the lockdown, the first lockdown in England, and then how I had to enter a second lockdown before I went in as third, lots of mistakes have been made. There's inquiries already underway about how contracts are handed out. But for me, the language that was used is they were unwilling or unable to admit they got things wrong. I think integrity is probably the most important thing that people look for in us as elected politicians, and that's where trust is built. And to be able to say, you know what, we got this wrong, we based it on either wrong evidence or we thought we had better judgment, I think it's the first step. And I think what's been clear with the First Minister in Scotland is that she's been prepared to say that. We no need. In fact, also Jean Freeman, particularly over care homes, she said recently before she retired about the difficulties they faced and the mistakes that were made. People won't be surprised that mistakes were made. This is a pandemic. It's been 100 years since we had our last one. We were ill prepared. It was also a new pandemic in a way, in as much as with modern travel today compared to 100 years ago, it's very fast how it travelled around the world. And we're wondering, the British Isles, the UK as a whole, was not the only country to get caught out really bad. Italy, Spain, the US. So I think their approach has been, in the early days, was overly positive. And then they tried to make political decisions rather than based on scientific evidence. I think the UK government now is moving in the right direction. But to come to this point, the reason I say cack-handed is, if you want to get to the point where people can move on with their lives, there's a lot of people asking questions just now, particularly those who've been directly affected by COVID and what went wrong. The way to help people move on is to be upfront and honest about where we're at. And therefore, I would have said a full and comprehensive public inquiry should happen as soon as possible, not waiting another year. And if it's for political gain based on the bounce of the vaccination, that's worse than cynical. It's outrageous, because yes, we're all positive. I mean, there's no doubts about it. Those of us have had first vaccinations, or for some of our more vulnerable groups who've had both vaccinations, it's a welcome relief. But this isn't about positive versus negative. It's about understanding what went wrong to prevent what happens in the future. And 12 months is a long time away. And given what's happening in India right now with new variants, new variant obviously in Brazil, we don't know where the next bit's going to break out. So the quicker we learn the lessons, the better. And that's why I'm deeply disappointed the UK government's put it back till next year.
Thanks, Chris. I've got a feeling we'll come back to the integrity of elected politicians later on in our conversation this evening. But for the moment, we'll return to Scotland and the news that the Scottish Child Payment has helped nearly 79,000 young people. An estimated 78,775 children have already benefited from the Scottish Child Payment since its launch. The benefit, which is unique to Scotland, is intended to help low-income families with the costs of raising a child. It gives qualifying parents and carers £40 every 4 weeks for each child under the age of 6. A total of 92% of the applications received and processed have been approved, and payments started in February. Applications were received from people living in all 32 local authority areas in Scotland, with the highest number of 17,330 from Glasgow City. Parents and carers are able to apply for all eligible children in their household in a single application, and can also apply for Best Start grants and Best Start foods at the same time. The Scottish Child Payment is an addition to the UK-wide child benefit. So Chris, first of all, what's your perspective on these reports on the take-up of the Scottish Child Payment?
Well, so the child payment is £40, as you've quite really pointed out, £40 every 4 weeks, in addition to child benefit, which is a benefit that's been around for, frankly, generations, and has been needed to be overhauled for quite some time. It's really positive that it's had such a good uptake. It means that the Scottish Government's communicating effectively in order to make sure that people become aware of it. You've also mentioned that there are Best Start grants and Best Start foods that are available as well for low-income families. So as a range of packages, essentially, as tools to tackle child poverty. Other measures we've already undertook, increasing child carers, as well as the baby boxes, so we get the early start from the beginning. And with free school meals for all school-aged children as part of the manifesto on the Scottish Government, that'll take another step forward to tackling child poverty. Speaking personally, I grew up in a time when child benefit was hugely important to my family, who were on a very low income. I had a disabled mother, single parent, and so this is really beneficial at the moment. It's a small amount, but with the package of other measures we've put in place, we can start to really tackle child poverty, and it's been welcomed by Child Poverty Action Group and others, this power. So it shows that welfare powers that have been devolved to Scotland have made a change, and naturally the more powers that are devolved to Scotland, the better. It gives us the best opportunity to give our young people the best start in life.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm interested in just as well, is the Scottish Child Payment either in isolation or, as you say, as part of the package of Best Start grants and foods on the baby box and other changes that the Scottish Government is making and promoting? Is the Scottish Child Payment turning up in your constituency workload? Are people asking about it?
Yes, absolutely. We have some of the deprived communities in Dundee, so therefore welfare plays a big part in the reasons why people contact my office and need my support. The welfare rights officers in the team here at Dundee City Council are second to none. They're absolutely superb. And in many ways, during COVID with the lockdown, because they're able to see each other much more effectively and quickly through working as we are just now through these screens, we've managed to get the uptick to a very high degree, and it's been really positive. Child poverty is one of the biggest illnesses in society, and as much as children grow up in very poverty-stricken surroundings, have the least life chances going forward, and that in terms of the life expectancy, opportunity, in terms of employment or education and so forth. So for Scotland to build forward better, we need to continue these kinds of initiatives, such as this child payment that's being made now.
Thanks, Chris. We'll return south of the border now for the next story, as bankers quit London and Brexit relocations to the EU step up. Investment banks are shifting more rainmakers out of London to financial centres across the European Union, accelerating the pace of moves after the pandemic and uncertainty over the UK's access to the bloc has slowed relocations. Morgan Stanley, Barclays, and Goldman Sachs are among those moving senior bankers, according to sources at the lenders, as European regulators push banks to better staff their EU offices and travel restrictions ease. Local hiring has also increased. The lack of any breakthrough in talks for a meaningful deal between Brussels and London on financial services post-Brexit has added to the impetus. Client-facing bankers in London are required a chaperone based inside the EU whenever they speak to EU clients, spurring some to relocate to avoid that complication when sealing deals. Lifestyle choices are also playing their part, with traders and some other senior staff moving too. Working from home during the pandemic enabled some bankers to leave London for warmer continental climes, mirroring a shift by Wall Street executives to Miami during the height of the COVID outbreak in New York. Some European bankers are now looking at making the shift permanent. So, Chris, what do you think this story says about the prospects for the City of London as the implications of Brexit begin to play out?
So you've touched on two aspects. One is Brexit, and the other one is the impact of the pandemic and people working from home. I think in terms of Brexit, the lessons, all the warnings were given leading up to the referendum. They were given up in the debates in Parliament post-referendum, and right up to the point where we left the EU. There has been a failure of negotiations with the UK government in the EU to move, for example, the financial instruments and the services in a way that would work supposedly seamlessly between the EU and the UK. Now, as a financial sector, as an area I worked in the past, 7% of the UK's income comes from financial services. And this is not day-to-day transaction stuff we're talking about at your local bank. This is investment bankers. This is traders. This is people who earn big salaries and pay significant taxes into our national tax system. Already 7,500 jobs. In fact, I think the last number I saw was 7,600 jobs have already left. And Frankfurt and Paris have become the biggest beneficiaries from this. And with these new rules uncertain, it means for people who maybe be hanging off, what's happened with the pandemic, people working at home, they're going, hold on a second here. My job's become increasingly difficult because we are no longer in the EU. There are other opportunities in Europe. Why don't we consider moving there? So I think lifestyle choice does play a part, but I wouldn't say it's the biggest part. We've already seen institutions already leave for Europe before Brexit actually happened. And of course, HSBC leave London previously. So I think what we're seeing is a little bit of that from people with lifestyle choices, I guess. But to lose investment bankers and investment banks where deals will be made in Europe and not in the UK will have long-term consequences for London as a financial trading centre. And I don't think it'll be immediate, but certainly in the coming 2 to 3 years, I think we'll see some significant impacts. And the UK government will have to answer to the electorate because the general election will be probably around the corner by that point, where the real impact of Brexit will be felt. And they can't blame it on COVID. They'll have to look at why is their tax returns lower, and it will directly be impacted by what happens to London.
Thanks, Chris. Now, staying with high finance, Boris Johnson has been served with a court judgment over a £535 unpaid debt. Boris Johnson has had a county court judgment issued against him for a debt that has not been paid, official records show, placing the Prime Minister at risk of not only a bad credit rating, but potential enforcement action by bailiffs arriving at Downing Street. The official register of county court judgments for England and Wales shows that Johnson had a judgment against him in October last year over an unpaid debt of £535. The register does not give details of to whom the debt is owed. Johnson's spokesperson said he had no immediate information about the reason for the debt or the creditor, but said that it was not connected to the recent refurbishment of his flat in Downing Street. Now, Chris, you've run businesses before, So you'll no doubt know some chancers who never pay up. What do you think that this story says about the Prime Minister? That he is incompetent with his finances, or that paying his dues is just not his style?
Well, I have to say, the headline should be something like Boris versus the bailiffs, because it is totally embarrassing. This is a story that's not just UK. People see this overseas. That the Prime Minister, and we're not talking large sums of money here, I think it's something like 400 or 500 quid, has had a county court judgment against him, where the bailiffs could turn up at number 10 to take away his TV or something else in order to pay that fine. Now, I know that we haven't heard what the fine is for, or if there's a mistake being made around it, but for anybody that's watched these awful programmes about what happens in England, where the bailiffs turn up at your door and can effectively remove things to be sold, this would be an abject humiliation. Boris Johnson has been in the press so much in recent weeks. If it's not cash for curtains, it is how how he's received money. He's claimed he's not earning enough, and in fact, he needs to earn £300,000 a year just to get by. He lives in another universe to be saying something like that. He should come to Dundee and listen to my constituents. I'm sure they can think of a whole range of things they could do with money like that. So to find that he's £500-600 and been taken to court and may not even be aware that it's happened is a complete bungle by Boris. And if the bailiffs turn up, then he's only got himself to blame, because ordinarily, if you get a court order through your door saying you have a bill to pay, most people would deal with it immediately. And I think we're going to see more, not of this story, but stories like it in the coming days and weeks to come, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's three inquiries at the moment regarding Boris's finances and how he's been handling his flat that he's been doing up, as we'd call in Dundee.
No, you're absolutely right. There are currently three inquiries relating to those activities. Now,
I
as
should
you
add,
spoke
can I
earlier,
just add, Andrew, if it's okay?
go on. Yes.
I was just going to say, Andrew, if Boris Johnson can't afford to appeal, he can request from the court for the £100 to be waived. So I hope he's listening to this, because he does have that available to him.
I was tempted to ask what your constituency advice would have been if he had approached you as a voter, but I managed to resist the temptation. But you've told him anyway, so that's a good thing. You earlier spoke about integrity in elected politicians. Is this seemingly minor matter, as you say, the Prime Minister earns over £100,000 a year as his salary? Is this seemingly minor matter an insight into the way that Johnson regards his obligations to other people?
Well, we've had a number of insights into Boris in the last 18 months and previously, before he was elected. What astonishes me, I have to say, Andrew, is that it doesn't seem to damage his reputation in England. This is the bit I find shocking. He's got appalling poll ratings here in Scotland in terms of popularity, but if you look at Westminster voting intentions from Britain Elects just 2 days ago, it put the Conservatives at 11 points clear of Labour. Now, if that doesn't concern people, I don't know what does, because it's not like an isolated incident, this county court judgment. There is a whole range of incidents that are already in the public domain, and it's almost like it matters not. It also not just reflects on Boris Johnson and the way he handles his life with others, but also reflects on the leader of the Labour Party, which must be asking questions what he needs to do, who, Sir Keir Starmer, is a man of great integrity and asks really difficult questions as Prime Minister week after week, but doesn't seem to be cutting it with his audience and his electorate in England, as we saw with the recent council elections.
Absolutely, Chris. We'll move on to our next story, which is that there are reports today that Radovan Karadzic will serve the rest of his prison sentence in the United Kingdom. The UK government has agreed that the former Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic, convicted of war crimes during the Bosnian War of the 1990s, should be transferred to a British prison to serve the rest of his sentence. Radovan Karadzic is one of the few people to have been found guilty of genocide. He was responsible for the massacre of men, women, and children at the Srebrenica genocide and helped prosecute the siege of Sarajevo with its remorseless attacks on civilians, said the UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab. Chris, what do you think's going on here? Why has the Foreign Secretary offered to house Karadzic for the rest of his time in jail?
Really difficult one to answer. I understand it was voluntary. In other words, they had offered. I understand also perhaps this new global Britain that the UK government likes to call itself, maybe trying to show that it stands up to with other partners to protect international law. However, it's slightly duplicitous. We have the situation, for example, in China with 1 million Uyghurs who are in so-called re-education camps. We've heard atrocities of forced sterilisation, rapes, and other activities, incredible surveillance over the Uyghurs. And yet, and many communities around the world, international communities, called out as genocide, yet Dominic Raab has not. Now, Radovan Karadzic, I should say, was imprisoned for his role in the genocide that happened in the early 90s, 1992, which led to 100,000 people dying, more than 2 million homeless. And of course, the awful massacre was sort of the pinnacle in Srebrenica, where 8,000 men and boys were taken away and murdered. So the UK taking him here, it's not the first time the UK government's done this. There has been other leaders in the past as well. I believe it's going to be anonymous to which jail it is. But I think if the UK government's going to have any real kind of substance to its empty rhetoric of global Britain, this is not it. There is lots more it can be doing. It's cut to UK aid in the world, where it has been a real global partner, is chronic. It's unbelievable, in fact. And it's increased spend on nuclear weapons, not to mention the proliferation of trident weapons, again, is not playing its part as a global partner for a force for good.
No, that's absolutely right, Chris. I was wondering if there was, on the one hand, we've seen in the last week the US government acknowledge and recognise the events at the end of the First War that led to the genocide in Armenia. The US government has finally accepted that. The UK government does not, I believe. And so you would think at a time when the recognition and treatment of those responsible for genocide has been on the international stage again. Is this the UK hanging on the US coattails, or heaven forfend, is this Dominic Raab virtue signalling?
If it is, it's not good enough, frankly. The recent defence and strategic review is a shift towards the Indo-Pacific. It's called the Indo-Pacific Tilt, and it's where future trade they wish to base in Asia. So that'll be the Indian subcontinent, China, South Korea, Japan, and so on. And what I find very difficult about the UK government at the moment is you can't do both things. If you're going to trade with countries who are practicing genocide or certainly crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, whatever else, you have the opportunity to use your voice, particularly if you're sitting on the Security Council at the UN. And increasingly, and Dominic Raab will and has said in front of my committee and in Parliament that he abhors it, but he will not use the word genocide. Now we're bringing this war, brutal murderer of mass atrocities in what was former Yugoslavia to the UK. If that's virtue signalling, it may well be, but it's certainly not enough. What I've heard from Joe Biden, and you've quite rightly mentioned about him calling out what happened with Armenia, where 1 million citizens lost their lives during the Ottoman Empire as genocide, is a bold step forward for the US. It's the first time. But in the past, David Cameron has done it himself. I can't remember what specific it was over just now, but I do remember him apologising. Well, actually, I do. It was over the Northern Ireland, what happened in Northern Ireland on Bloody Sunday. So it's time for the UK government to step up and actually call things for what they are, rather than trying to hide behind other words, and also bring in a brutal war murderer to the UK. That's not sufficient. However, I am pleased that Radovan Karadzic is going to spend the rest of his life in prison. I was in Holland in the early 90s, and I met people, refugees, and lived with refugees from not just Bosnia and Montenegro, but also from Serbia, who were involved in some of the forces at the time who were fleeing because of the brutality that was on both sides. And for anybody that's read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from South Africa, there are victims on all sides here. And so those leaders, and Karadzic being one of them, were rightly tried at the International Criminal Court. And just going back earlier to what we were discussing about Israel-Palestine, international law must be upheld at all times, and government has to speak out without fear or favour, whichever nation is at fault here, without worrying about trade agreements. And if it is about attaching itself to the US, well, it needs to do an awful lot more.
Thanks, Chris. We'll take some news from the USA briefly now. And a Minnesota judge has ruled that aggravating factors were involved in the death of George Floyd, opening the possibility of a longer sentence for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Chauvin, a former police officer convicted in Minnesota State Court of murdering George Floyd, is scheduled to be sentenced on multiple murder and manslaughter convictions on June 25th. In a 6-page ruling dated today, District Court Judge Peter Cahill found that prosecutors had proven that Chauvin abused his position of trust and authority, treated Floyd with particular cruelty, committed the crime as a group, and did so with children present, all of which are aggravating factors. A jury convicted Chauvin, 45, of second and third degree murder and manslaughter on April 20th, after hearing 3 weeks of testimony in a highly publicised trial. Chris, what do you think are the possible lessons for Scotland from the ongoing events in Minneapolis?
So Black Lives Matter, what happened under George Floyd is not unique. It just so happened, because it'd been recorded by bystanders, it travelled around the world very quick. The Black Lives Matter movement, actually several years ago, I think it was one of the COP meetings, in fact, I think it was the one in Germany, and he talked about the decades long, in fact centuries long, where black and other ethnic minority groups were disadvantaged in a whole range of ways, and police brutality was very much part of their message that seems to be against them much more increasingly so, including deaths in custody. The lessons, I think, for Scotland from it is that we need to accept our own past. We've talked about over the last year about what do we do about our own, for example, Henry Dundas in Edinburgh, the statue where Dundas has been embroiled in a debate around whether or not he allowed slavery to be extended. But what happened to George Floyd, an utter tragedy, has some light at the end of the tunnel, because when I listened to his brother 2 weeks ago after the judgment, he said, whilst it's incredibly grievous that he's lost his own brother, justice has been served. And I think what the judge did today was, by raising it to being, there was an aggravated, because it's second degree murder he was found guilty on, but because it was aggravated, it can extend his sentence. His sentence under the Minnesota rules can be as little as 10 years, with a maximum of 15 years as it stood with the judgment 2 weeks ago. But now what we're seeing is, with this aggravated a judgment today, that can be as much as 25 years. Nobody's trying to... I think the lessons in Scotland is racism is everywhere. Hamza Yousaf, our Justice Secretary, talks about regularly the level of abuse that he has experienced. And we have to see that change, the top down, in business as well as in politics. I'm pleased to say that we have our first women from an Indian background that's been elected, with Kokab Stewart, and also first Conservative Sikh woman from Punjab in India who's been elected as well, and I think that's right. And unless our role models don't come from those backgrounds, we'll always find it difficult to challenge racism.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, as you were saying, we saw the election on Thursday of Pam Gosal, who is of a Sikh background for the Scottish Conservatives. You're absolutely right. Thank you. And now, for our final item, we'll move to the First Minister's message for Eid. In a message to Scotland's Muslim community ahead of the start of Eid al-Fitr, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said today, Eid al-Fitr, the end of Ramadan's month of fasting, is a profoundly important event to Muslims across Scotland and around the world. This is the second Eid to have taken place during the pandemic, which I know has been incredibly challenging. I want to thank community leaders and members for doing an amazing job keeping each other safe during this difficult period. I understand how disappointing it will be to have to restrict celebrations. However, everyone celebrating Eid must do so safely and in line with the necessary public health restrictions. Unfortunately, that means not visiting other people's homes and maintaining a 2-metre distance with those from outside your household at all times. The changes to lockdown restrictions I announced yesterday will be welcome to many, but they do not come into force until Monday, so everyone should continue to follow the Level 3 restrictions that still apply in all areas of Scotland until then. We know from public health data that travel from India, Pakistan, Turkey and Nepal is a particular risk, so everyone arriving from those countries must follow the red list rules. I know following these rules during such a significant event will be difficult, particularly when the overall picture with the virus is positive. However, cases are high and rising in Moray and Glasgow is seeing an increase in cases too. By sticking to the Level 3 restrictions for just a few more days, we can all help to keep the virus under control and ensure Scotland stays on the path to recovery. I'd like to say a deep thank you to all of Scotland's Muslim communities for everything you have done during the pandemic and wish you an enjoyable Eid. The First Minister visited Glasgow Central Mosque on Wednesday, 12 May, alongside Justice Secretary Humza Yousaf and Scottish Labour leader and Glasgow MSP Anna Sarwar. And that is the news in Scotland at 7 this evening. I would like to say a particular thank you to Chris Law, who's joined us this evening to discuss the news. Chris, your insight and your help with discussing the news, in particular your reflections from your position sitting on Westminster committees, has been invaluable this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen just now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, thank you again to Chris Law for joining us this evening, and thank you everyone for joining us too. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.